Well, good evening, everybody. I think we're all mostly gathered now. If not everybody, there'll be maybe a few joining, but let's make a start. First of all, for those who don't know me, I'm Quentin Kopp, and I'm acting chair and events organizer in any case for the society. Tonight's George Talk is with David Milton, who's the son of Harry Milton, who volunteered with Orwell in the POUM and was also imprisoned with my father in the Chequers. And he will be in conversation with Chris Angel, and they'll be showing you a presentation. When I finish my introduction, the evening will start with Richard Blair Orwell's son and our patron reading a passage selected by David and Chris from Homage to Catalonia. I'd like to just run through the basic housekeeping, just to remind those who've been with us before and for those who haven't, to let you know that the meeting is going to be recorded and then will be posted on our website. If for any reason you would prefer not to have your face in the recording, then by all means just turn your camera off. Please leave yourselves on mute until at the end I ask you to unmute, or if I ask you to present a question in the question and answer session. Chris will be presenting slides which will appear on your screen, and you may want to assure that you get a full view of those by making sure that the faces move to the right of your screen so you get a proper view of it. If you want to ask a question, there we are. If you want to ask a question, please put your hand up, and I will try and catch everybody who wishes to raise a question. When you look at your own screen, if your own name isn't properly there, I'd be grateful, so we know who's attended, if you could use the function in Zoom to put your name up. At the end of the talk, we will end the recording after we finish the questions around 7 o'clock. If you want to stay on and continue to talk to Chris and David and ask questions, then please do, but that bit beyond 7 o'clock, it'll be clear where we've separated and it's not being recorded anymore. So without any further ado, I hope you enjoy the evening, and here's Richard to read from his father's work, Homage to Catalonia.
It was at the corner of the parapet at 5 o'clock in the morning. This was always a dangerous time because we had the dawn at our back. And if you stuck your head above the parapet, it was clearly outlined against the sky. I was talking to the sentries preparatory to changing the guard. Suddenly, in the middle of saying something, I felt, it was very hard to describe what I felt, although I remember it with utmost vividness. Roughly speaking, it was the sensation of being at the center of an explosion. There seemed to be a loud bang and a blinding flash of light all around me. I felt a tremendous shock, no pain, only a violent shock such as you'd get from an electric terminal. With it a sense of utter weakness, a feeling of being stricken and shriveled up to nothing. The sandbags in front of me receded into immense distance. I fancy you would feel much the same if you were struck by lightning. I knew immediately that I'd been hit. But because of seeming bang and flash, I thought a rifle nearby had gone off accidentally and shot me. All this happened in a space of time, much less than a second. The next moment, my knees crumpled and I was falling, my head hitting the ground with a violent bang, which, to my relief, did not hurt. I had a numb, dazed feeling, a consciousness of being very badly hurt, but no pain in the ordinary sense. The American sentry I had been talking to started forward. Gosh, are you hit? People gathered round. There was the usual fuss. Lift him up. Where's he been hit? Get his shirt open, etc., etc. The American called for a knife to cut my shirt open. I knew that there was one in my pocket and tried to get it out. But I discovered that my right arm was paralyzed. Not being in pain, I felt a vague satisfaction. This ought to please my wife, I thought. She had always wanted me to be wounded, which would save me from being killed when the great battle came.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. And now we're going to hear from the American himself. He was known to his comrades as Harry Milton. And this is some audio taken from an interview with Steve Wadhams for the Canadian Broadcasting Company radio documentary from either late 1983 or early 1984. See if I can get this to work.
To other people,
you know, I was on guard. He came to relieve me. He stepped on the there was a barricade of sandbags. There was a step, 2 sandbags. He got on the step, stuck his head over the parapet, which was very dangerous. And then I heard a shot, and he toppled over. I came down from the tree, and it was I who, remember, it's 50 years ago.
Yes,
it was I who looked for the wound. He had bitten his lips, so I thought he was a goner.
Yeah.
But he was shot through the neck, and the speed of the bullet seared the entrance. But when I put my hand, when I had his head in my arms, in my hands, and I put my hand under his neck, there was a puddle of blood. It was like a bloody omelet.
Yeah.
You see. Then the first aid men came, and they dragged him away. Well, I cut it. Well, he describes the young American cut the shirt open.
Yep.
See. The details are all very vague in my mind now.
Yes, I'm sure. But
So, who was this American, Harry Milton, who fought besides Orwell? So to find out more about him, I'm very excited to welcome his son, artist David Milton, who's a very talented, hardworking artist in Southern California. And now for this talk, I will be playing the role of the quintessentially rude American, who will be probably having to cut off David at times and try to keep him to the clock so he doesn't have to worry about that himself. And also wanted to let people know that David and I actually met in Hollywood as David wrote a fantastic screenplay about his father with his writing partner, Rhett Talbot. And as some of you may know, I'm also myself adapting Peter Stansky's biography of Orwell into a mini-series. So if either of us make any mistakes in the history today, it's purely a product of the fact that we've been writing some historical fiction and have to compress events, but we'll try to stick to the facts. So without further ado, I will introduce David, and let me begin
to other people.
by playing that. No. Let me begin by asking you, David, about your father's early life, where he was born, what his education schooling was like, and a little bit about his name when he was young.
Well, good evening and good morning to comrades all across the world here. Happy to be here and share the recollections I do have. This photograph is not the factory my father worked in as a young man, but it's typical of a garment factory in New York City at the time. My father left home at a very early age, 13 or 14, and was able to support himself by getting a job and learning some skills in a garment factory.
And what was his name growing up? And why did he change it to David Milton?
Well, the names are an interesting story. He was born into a family when they immigrated to America that was called, the last name was Kupinsky. And in typical fashion, when they arrived in New York in immigration, they shortened Kupinsky actually to Kopin. So my father was known actually both by Kupinsky and Kopin. But when he left home, he decided that it was very risky to have anyone in the government know his association with his family. So he made up this pseudonym, Harry Milton. And that's what he went by by the time the Spanish War broke out. He had been using that name for over 15 years.
And why would he want to sort of hide his family from his actual activities? What was he doing once he got to the
Well,
garbage
he
factories?
very quickly got involved as a young man with the socialist left movement in New York. He read voraciously Trotsky's writings and other socialist manifestos. He joined the Socialist Workers' Party and paid his dues quite regularly, I saw from his card. So by the time the war in Spain broke out, he'd been self-educating himself for many years. He spent many, many days and hours at the New York Public Library reading and researching. And he fell in with a group of intellectuals, college professors and intellectuals. He was the only actual working class guy in the group. And he ultimately was the only one that actually went to Spain as well.
And so some of the people that he met, were professors, intellectuals. He also met Diego Rivera. Can you tell us just briefly about a little bit of the backstory of this? This is a panel from the union that he was a member of. They had a retreat in upstate New York, right?
Correct. Diego Rivera and his wife, Frida, had come to New York to do the murals that he'd been commissioned by Rockefeller to do the mural at Rockefeller Center. And that became a cause célèbre very quickly with this group of people because Rockefeller insisted that certain faces be removed from the panels. Well, as an artist, Diego Rivera said, "The hell with you, I'm sticking to my guns," and he ultimately was paid, but the murals were completely destroyed. So other than fictional portrayals like in the movie Frida, we don't have any evidence of them. Meanwhile, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union had been sending money to Spain to help in the cause, but they also felt that they would commission Diego Rivera to do this series of murals at the union retreat in upstate New York for their workers. And he did about 13 panels that were quite large. As a child, I was shown one of the panels where his upraised fist had been used and modeled. And this particular panel shows somebody in the background with an upraised fist, but I recall a different panel with the fist in the foreground. But this is my father was a very sturdy fellow, and his hands, I think, were the perfect model for Diego Rivera.
Yeah, and sadly, this building burned down, so we've lost the murals. These are just period photos. I don't have photos of all of them. It's really an interesting connection there. So war breaks out in Spain, and what does your father do?
Well, my father was about as ready to make a decision about this as anyone could have been. I think it was anticipated that the war would break out. Franco had come back with troops, and there'd been a military coup d'etat, and yet there was tremendous resistance throughout Spain, and so there was a fight. The democratically elected government of Spain was overthrown, and basically it was another front in the fight against fascism, which my father was more than willing and ready to participate in. He made the decision that he would go, and he had to figure out how to get there because it was illegal to travel to Spain. The United States was officially neutral. He fortunately had a relationship with a socialist magazine in New York, and he went and approached the editor about writing about the war as a journalist, which he had done some writing already anyways, but the editor agreed, and they decided that the only way he could participate, get there and participate in the war would be to have these photographs of Leon Trotsky. Basically, these were used as what we would use as a safe password now. He was able to take several of these. These are home photographs that he was given. And once he arrived in Spain, he would present these, and this would assure anyone that he came in contact with that he wasn't a spy or Stalinist agent or a fascist hiding amongst them. So he had these wonderful photographs, some of which I found after my dad's passing. I found additional photographs. Most of his letters and papers and photographs were donated to the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, which I will continue to do at some point soon with the remaining documents that I have found.
Then if you, so he shows up in Spain, ostensibly as a journalist. He has these photos of Trotsky. That naturally led him to a course, a different course, right, which is to go towards the POUM. Do you know how quickly he decided he would go fight in the war?
Well, he knew he had to get to whatever the headquarters were in Barcelona. He was directed to the Lenin barracks in Barcelona, where the POUM was doing some rudimentary training before they were shipped out to the front. And this photograph of the POUM militia group at the POUM headquarters, the Lenin barracks, actually does not show my father, because he would have disappeared into that crowd, probably being no taller than the shortest man in the group. He was just around 5 feet tall. But at the very back of that interesting photograph is George Orwell. And you can see that his head and shoulders literally are above everyone else, even at that distance.
So your father enlisted in the POUM almost immediately from what we know, and trained. We won't go into too many of the details that are in homage to Catalonia, but your sense was that what Orwell was writing about the disorganization of the POUM was sort of correct. It was very ad hoc. And your father was quickly sent off to the front, as we know, in a parade such as Orwell describes. And then he served. This is in your personal collection, correct? Is that
correct? This is a photograph which has been used on book jackets. Peter Stansky's book, Orwell, The Transformation. My father gave permission to use this photograph. This actually was a very small photograph, not much larger than what we call a wallet photograph, that survived. And this was the original one that my father had. My mother showed this to me as a child. It was actually in our family photo album, and it's the first time I learned anything about Orwell or the Spanish Civil War or my father's involvement in it. The photograph literally was next to, a photograph of Aunt B and Uncle Abe, and I asked my mother what this was, and she said, "Oh, that's your father at the front with George Orwell, and that's his wife." Just as plain and straightforward as that.
And then, as we've been researching this, you've shared another photo that's in your family photo album, one that actually I had not seen before. And I thought this was really interesting. This is taken probably the same day, or certainly the same 24-hour period as that previous one. And I'll just quickly read the inscription here. It says, "Group of ILP section after Harry forms the quote-unquote soldiers committee. Standing 3 o'clock or 3:30 from the left is yours truly." And I think it's signed John B. And so looking, I think it's John Braithwaite, if I pronounce that correctly, who sent a letter to your father. Your father's the one sitting in the very front. That's Harry with the hat, with his hands adjusting his hat. But can you talk a little bit about what the Soldiers Committee might have been, and again, what your father said about sort of his understanding of politics when he was fighting in the POUM?
Well, my father's self-education was pretty refined by the time he arrived in Spain. He particularly understood the factions among the left. He had described his initial conversations with George Orwell that Orwell was politically naive and didn't quite understand why all these people on the left were feuding and fighting amongst each other. My father quite well understood that the Stalinists, who were still also fighting the fascists, had no interest in the Trotskyites in the POUM being successful. And that accounts for why the armaments were real second-rate stuff, stuff left over from World War I and possibly even earlier.
Thank you. Yeah, and I don't know if George Orwell's in this photograph or not. There's one person in silhouette in the back, so I'm always curious now that I've seen this if that might be him. But certainly it's taken that same 24-hour period, so thank you again for sharing this with us.
Sure.
It also does specify that it was taken at La Granja front, it says. And just again, to remind people who haven't been there, La Granja is just on the outskirts of Huesca, where Orwell famously said that he wanted to, or they all said they wanted to have coffee in Huesca, never quite managed it. But sort of as this war goes on, what did your father tell you, or how did he reminisce about fighting in the Spanish Civil War in later years?
Well, my father didn't mince words about the misery of life in the trench. Your long periods of boredom, long periods of food deprivation, and apparently there was more potable wine at the front than water, certainly for cleaning or bathing. And basically it's a continuous state of misery of sorts. You get a little bit of sleep, you get a little bit of food, long periods with nothing happening, and then suddenly people are shot the way one terrible morning George Orwell's fate was shot. A bullet about this size was the bullet that Orwell would have been shot with at fairly close range. And it was really a miracle wound. All the doctors that were part of examining him or treating him said it was a complete medical miracle that the bullet had missed a major artery or a bone or really any major nerves. It did destroy for a short time his speech and vocal cords, but eventually he made almost a full recovery.
And then to back up just for 1 second, something you sort of told me in our previous conversations that was interesting, is that your dad, is it fair to say that he also idealized this time of the war before the May Days, and especially maybe in comparison to World War II, that he thought it was like a just fight and something he was glad he did? Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. A justified war, the necessary war, a good war. And my father, being a romantic at heart, I think there were parts of it that he may have even savored and enjoyed. I remember him describing to me in the spring of that year of 37 that the vineyards were basically rotting and not being harvested, but you could still smell the sweet smell of the fruit, and that he described the air as smelling like ambrosia.
And he also told you something to be like what to be thankful for in your own life at times, right?
Oh, yes. Because of the physical discomforts and the misery of fighting in a trench, anytime I ventured to complain about anything in my life, he would simply say, what are you complaining about? Your stomach is full of warm food, you're warm, you're dry, and most importantly, no one is shooting at you. That's been good counsel over the years.
So against this background of serving at the trenches, in May of 1937, the unit is given some leave, and I think both your dad and Orwell, George Kopp and others are back in Barcelona. And as we know, this is sort of the beginning of the May Days. This is the Placa Catalunya that famously, I think there's a machine gun nest at that sea. Nick Lloyd likes to tell those of us who've gone on the tour. So your father's going to take a break. He's excited, I think, to get some rest and some sleep. And then what happens next?
Well, Orwell and my father and other members of the militia unit, I believe, were given furlough to return to Barcelona, and they were looking forward to decent food, and Orwell specifically had mentioned in some of his writings clean sheets. And before they had a chance to do anything, fighting broke out in the streets on the Ramblas. between factions of the POUM and the Stalinists. At this point, the war was beginning to fall apart. It was obvious to people participating in this fighting that not only did they have the enemy back at the front, the fascists at the front, but they had a second enemy at the rear. And my father and Orwell were stationed on the roof of a cinema, which is still there on the Ramblas, for about 3 days. And they took turns going out to retrieve food and get information. And they were able to,
even before that, actually, just remind people, in homage, your father was actually walking up the Ramblas and was shot at by soldiers stationed inside the Cafe Mocha.
Yes, and that description, that description described my father as having to, he was unarmed at the moment and had to duck behind a kiosk to avoid being shot, and miraculously did avoid that. But
and this moment, George Kopp comes out, and Orwell tries to shoot at the grenades. George Kopp managed to negotiate a ceasefire, local ceasefire.
And a diversion, I suppose, of sorts at the moment. Yes.
So they end up on the rooftop. So your father served on the rooftop as well. This is the rooftop of the Poliorama theaters, and we know that there's a museum and an institute on the roof and an observatory. And here's a photograph, I think, from one of our tours of the view of the roof. And so your father was up there as well. And what happened next to him after the May Days?
Well, after surviving the May Days, the militia unit returned to the front. And this was actually when Orwell was shot. As described earlier, the Stalinists at this point were hunting the POUM members, and the war was falling apart. Orwell was shot and taken out of action to recover, and my father was fleeing for his life, as he described later in prison letters, that everyone was running for their lives. He attempted to cross the frontier back into France, but unfortunately he was taken prisoner by the Stalinists and returned to Barcelona, thrown in a dungeon, a prison that had terrible conditions. I'll read very briefly in his own words. The day before yesterday, I was arrested by the authorities at Port Bow, brought back here, and without being an opportunity to speak or to make any explanation, thrown into jail. The conditions here in jail beggar description: a long, damp stone room, about 100 persons in it, absolutely no provisions for sleeping or resting, no beds, blankets, or any sanitary facilities. We're fed twice a day, one thin piece of bread and a little platter of rice and potato soup. He had further described to me that he had lost a significant amount of weight in just a few weeks. And the conditions were so grim and so desperate that a decision was made among the prisoners, initiated by my father, to start a hunger strike. The hunger strike appeared to be the only real alternative to bring any focus internationally on the plight of these people, but especially this American that was being held in the prison in Barcelona. So it's only conjecture, but these letters were smuggled out of the prison, very possibly by the Red Cross, someone that he had made a contact with. Again, I'll read briefly. It's becoming increasingly difficult for me to get my letters out. Yesterday, I learned that the contact through which my letters were sent out of the country was herself arrested and was compelled to destroy some of the letters she had. I don't know exactly which letters they were, but one of them probably was to be sent to the Socialist Party of America. Well, I believe that letter must have gotten out because his group back in New York, the leftist socialist group that he was part of, took up the cause of my father being in prison, and a telegraph writing campaign ensued to make the U.S. government aware that this young Jewish American had been taken prisoner by the Stalinists in Barcelona during the war. And as a result, there was some negotiation, but there must have also been a conversation between Cordell Hull and Roosevelt. Hull could not have been authorized to interfere and get my father released through the consulate in Barcelona unless Roosevelt had authorized it. So ultimately, my father was actually released through the direct intervention of Cordell Hull, Secretary of State of the U.S. at the time. And he was shipped back to first France and then put on a freighter back to America. The socialist newspaper in New York published a small article using the name Kupinsky, which probably was appalling to my father because he had wanted them to probably keep with the name Harry Milton, which he was trying to protect his family. He didn't want his family, if he had been killed, to know that he had been killed, or the American government to really know what his activities were. But so he came back from Spain in one piece, and the Socialist Party immediately decided that he should work for them and go on a nationwide propaganda tour speaking about the rise of fascism in Europe as an American who had experienced it firsthand.
And what did a propaganda tour mean to them at the time? He wasn't.
Well, I think it was, yeah, thanks, Chris. I think generally speaking, and here's a photograph of the young radical Harry Milton speaking to a group. I think people were aware of what was going on, but to hear someone who had fought in the war, survived it, and come back to speak about it firsthand was a much more powerful means of educating people. So he went all over the United States for about a year on what was unabashedly called a propaganda tour, and honed his skills as a speaker and an educator. During the same period of time, he corresponded with Leon Trotsky, who had heard about my father's participation in the Spanish War and was impressed with his political savvy, but specifically with his physical courage. They needed a bodyguard, and they also needed a secretary and a driver, but that was secondary. And Trotsky was at this time in Mexico in exile, living with Diego Rivera and trying to survive there, which unfortunately was not the case. Before my father actually would have gone to Mexico, Trotsky was assassinated.
And meanwhile, in New York, what was the climate like there, and what was your father involved with?
Well, New York City was host to the Nazis of the time, American Nazis of that time. There were huge rallies at Madison Square Garden. There were huge demonstrations in front of places like Macy's that were still buying German goods. There was a lot of protest about that. And my father still, after his propaganda tour, went back to work for some time, doing what he knew how to do in the garment business to support himself. And he formed a group called the Anti-Fascist Union Guard, which I don't know exactly what their activities were, what interaction they had with the Nazis at Madison Square Garden, but he was preparing for possible conflict in the streets of New York, I suppose, at this point, which I don't think actually happened. But not too much longer after this period, the war broke out in Europe, and my father, as an older man, at this point he was into his early, but probably approaching his mid-30s. He said he was a few years younger to the authorities, and right after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the infantry. He wasn't interested in being in any other part of the military operation. He wanted to be in the trenches, fighting the Nazis right up close and personal. Around the same time, my mother and he were courting each other, and when he came back from basic training on furlough, they got married.
And then where did he serve once he was shipped off to fight in the war?
For the first year of the war, the Americans and the Allies thought that the Nazis might try to invade over the polar cap. So they sent quite a large group of soldiers to Greenland to protect that front. And when that never happened, he had the first year of the war there. I think he suffered some frostbite while he was there. And eventually, of course, since that didn't happen, they pulled all the troops out and they were all shipped to the UK in preparation for D-Day, which he was a soldier that participated in that. He wasn't on the first day or the first couple of waves, but he did describe the misery of crossing the channel and how weak everyone was from getting seasick. And fortunately, they didn't have to hit the beaches like these guys, but once they got ashore, they made their way inland and continued fighting the Battle of the Bulge. And my father served, I think, over 3 years in Europe during this part of the war.
And then this is him during the war. It looks like a familiar location. Can you tell me where this was taken? And
well, anyone who has spent any time in the south of France in Nice might recall this. This is my father on leave in Nice. Actually, it wasn't so much a furlough as a rescue. A certain number of soldiers were in a raffle of some type, and he was literally pulled with a small group of lucky lottery winners out of the trench, and was able to go on furlough for a short period of time in Nice. And I think this photograph is from that period.
And when he returned, what did he discover from his unit?
Well, most of the men had either been wounded or killed, which accounts for why I'm alive and why I'm here.
And so then
survived the second war.
So the war ends. This is actually his discharge papers, or close up of it. And I do notice that he was given a Purple Heart. He was injured in the war.
Yeah, he was injured more than once, but this particular time he had described that he had been in an explosion with many hundreds of small pieces of metal fragment in his body and his face that it took hours to pick out. And he always just described it as a superficial wound, but they still awarded him a Purple Heart.
So after the war, he returned to New York, returned to raising his family. This is a picture of you and your mother when you were a young child.
Yes, and you can see I have a toy pistol there. I guess my father wanted me to be ready for action.
And what influence did your father have on you and sort of your eventual career as you grew up?
Well, my father came back from the war and was able to utilize the GI Bill. He took some photography classes and learned to process film and print them. And the two photographs here are samples of his work. He gravitated to taking photographs of the everyday man, the dignity of the working man, and the solitude. This photograph, I think, is rather poetic, of the figure with the bird and the man lighting his pipe.
And sort of for his regular work, he continued to work in the garment industry for the union. This is in Scranton. Can you tell what he did there?
Well, after many years working in the factories, he was offered, at the age of 50, he was offered what would be called his first full-time job. because the garment industry was seasonal work. But he had these organizational skills. He was offered a job as a union organizer. And so we moved from New York to Scranton, Pennsylvania, where our VP running for president now is from. And he organized factories to unionize that were not. It was considered a fairly dangerous job at the time. The person who he replaced had been reportedly murdered by the mob. So he was taking a job with a high degree of danger, which the family itself was unaware of. But I believe he kept a gun in his glove compartment during this period of time.
And speaking of danger, what advice did he give you during the Vietnam War?
Well, as the war in Vietnam broke out in the 60s, it was quite interesting. You know, here he had fought in 2 wars, but this was a war he was adamantly against and counseled me to stay out of it. Of course, I was a college student by this point, so I had the convenience of having a deferment. Any full-time college student had a 2S deferment. I didn't have bone spurs, but the deferment kept me out.
3, there was a war in Israel, and he decided to go in person. Can you tell me just briefly about that?
Typical of my father, the warrior, he wanted to die with his boots on and sword in hand. So when the war broke out in '73 in Israel, he decided if they would permit the planes to fly in, he would. He arrived on the 3rd or 4th day of a 3-week war, not knowing how long the war would be, but he volunteered at a kibbutz on the Jordan frontier, and was told that if the Egyptians came across the Jordan River, he was to blow up the minefield, which could have been a suicide mission actually, but that wasn't necessary, and he stayed on at the kibbutz, and they acknowledged him for his service and him sharing their way of life during that period of time.
And how important was it as you were growing up, or for him, to sort of his Jewish faith or identity? What part of him was that?
Well, he identified strongly with Israel as, I think he may have called himself a Zionist actually, but he had no religious convictions, nor do I. And yet he was a staunch supporter of Israel his whole life. This last photograph here shows it's a Thanksgiving when most of these people were still alive. My mother, father, uncle, and cousin are no longer alive in this, and my sister are no longer alive in this photograph, but this was 1987, so it's quite a while ago. And then here's a shot of my father, still proud of the fact that he could lose enough weight to squeeze into an Eisenhower jacket.
I think that's a very appropriate place to maybe leave off this part of it and open up to questions if people have them.
Sure.
Well, thank you both very much. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed that. I hope everybody else did. And who would like to start off by asking a question? Jason, you want to ask a question? Peter, please. Can you unmute yourself, please, Peter?
Well, thanks very much for that talk. Well, I wonder if David could talk any more about his father's relationship to Orwell. My memory is that in fact, that I had the great pleasure of meeting Harry. I think he was then living in Wilkes-Barre, if I remember correctly, and in Pennsylvania. And it seems to me that he felt that Orwell was in many ways politically underinformed and somewhat politically naive, and that he, to his credit, participated in Orwell's political education. In fact, might have been a major figure. Of course, Orwell. It's when, in my view, is that when Orwell was in Spain, that he made his firm commitment to socialism, and democratic socialism, as I understand it, as he famously said, I wonder if David did his father talk to him more about his conversations with Orwell and his relationship with Orwell.
Yes, actually he did, but I would say that my father was, he was there in the trench when Orwell was shot, and it may have been the simple act of elevating his body and keeping him from bleeding out until the medics arrived. He took very little credit for that, but I've talked to EMTs that said, well, keeping somebody from bleeding out is pretty important. Putting pressure on the back of his neck to keep him from bleeding out. And yet he did take some credit for informing Orwell of, as I was saying earlier, some of the nuances of the left. All these factions, all fighting amongst each other, which of course, I think that still happens today, doesn't it? The left does not seem to be able to be unified against the greater evil.
No, it's fairly true to say, certainly is over here, there's no battles more fierce than that between two adjacent factions of the left. Who would like to ask the next question? Ben, did you want to ask a question?
Masha has a hand up.
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, can I ask a question?
Please do, Masha.
Thank you very much. First of all, David and Chris, it was very interesting. I have two questions actually. One is about the letters that you showed. I'd seen these letters previously, and there is a tiny thing that I was wondering about, and maybe you could shed some light on the mystery that I think there is there. The first letter is dated 21st of May. Which definitely, 1937, which definitely it should be 21st of June, because the 20th of May was the date when Orwell was wounded, so they were still in the trenches, and this is the letter telling, the letter where Harry is talking about his arrest. And also POUM was only outlawed, was only made illegal on the 16th of June. So definitely it is the June letter. Now, do you think it was, do you think it was a mistake, or do you think it was done sort of on purpose? Maybe to confuse the people who were holding him, or just somehow to confuse those who arrested him, the NKVD and all this, because that was my theory. But and it's not just this letter. There are a couple of letters from this time when he was arrested, and they are dated May. And the next letter that you showed is dated 11th of July. So obviously, there hasn't been a month between them. What do you think about it, David and Chris?
Yeah, if I could jump in, because so what I did do, and I would recommend everybody who's interested, Marcia, you should do as well, is the Stanford Hoover Institute will send you a file if you request it, and it's very helpful.
I've got it.
Oh, you've got it already. So my theory, this is purely a theory, but I was looking at who these letters were to, and they were to a friend in New York City named Marty or Martin Alburn. And if you read carefully at the bottom of one of them, it seems that they were probably retyped by Martin for publication. And so there's some sort of notes, and he's like, oh, he added a sort of footnote saying like, he didn't get to finish this letter, but I think you can still publish it. And I actually, my theory is that Marty might have just made a mistake, because I saw also elsewhere that Harry was using the European system for dating things, and it's different than the American system. And I suspect that Marty just made a mistake in retyping.
Right, that is interesting. Thank you very much, because it didn't occur to me. And the second question, because I have read these letters, I just wanted David to ask David to say a few words about your father's relationship with George Cobb. Because as far as I remember, there were interesting references by Trotsky about George Cobb. And also, if I remember correctly, during the war, your father supplied George Cobb with some ingredients, with some food, because the American army was so well provided for that they could give some delicacies, I think even for Cobb's wedding. Am I right?
Well, this is all conjecture, of course, but the letters certainly could not have been typed in the prison. I can't imagine, considering that their conditions were so bleak, that they actually had typewriter paper and a typewriter there. So these letters had to have been handwritten originally and smuggled out. And my conjecture, and as I say, it's just a conjecture, is that it had to be someone who was had a reason to come back to the prison on a regular basis, which would have accounted for the idea of someone in the Red Cross, or someone who was posing as someone in the Red Cross. So the letters themselves were obviously smuggled out and then retyped. As to the dates, I long ago have given up on trying to figure out the logic of that. And it may not really be that important, except from, you know, a purely academic point of view. But because they were not typed by my father, it may have been more than one person that typed these letters. So that's a mystery part of this that we'll never know.
And what about
regarding Kopp? I will say my father described in the letters that he had met the commandant of the unit, George Kopp, that he was very friendly with him at the front, and it's Kopp who probably had photographed the original photographs, you know, of Orwell and the militia group. That definitely seems to be the reality, but they became very good friends in prison as well. And I would imagine the desperation and the cause that they were both fighting for formed a bond between them that was very significant.
Yeah. Well, certainly my father lost half his weight in those checkers, and while he had a certain amount of German lead in his body at different times during the Second World War, I think that contributed to his short life. Richard Keeble, I think you want to ask a question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Far away.
Thank you, David, for that terrific interview. I was interested in your comments about wine and water at the front. Seems to suggest that when in his book, John Ross, Orwell's Cough, says that meticulous about his moustache, Orwell kept appearances by shaving with wine, could be correct. Did your father ever mention that? Secondly, did you mention the newspaper he took accreditation for to get to Spain? Did he ever write any articles for it?
Yes, before he left for Spain, he had already written some reviews or articles, and that's why he had that relationship with the editor of that magazine. So
what's the name of it? What was the name of it?
I'm not 100% sure of that. The Socialist Daily, or I've never actually seen a copy of it, and it may have, you know, gone out of existence at some point. In any case,
right.
Yeah, but the question of the wine was quite interesting that you asked. Yeah, it was described that there was more potable wine and rations of wine at the front than drinking water or bathing facilities that would allow. Yeah.
Right. So one other brief question. You showed wonderful photographs of your father at the front. Now, Orwell also there with the intent photograph and took loads, and they were all stolen, I believe, on the raid by the Soviet secret police on the hotel in Milton. Did your father ever talk about that aspect of his connect with Orwell?
Your voice
sorry,
was very
cutting
indistinct.
it out. Yeah.
Did you get that, David, as a question?
No, it was very broken up.
I think what Richard was asking was that you've clearly got a number of your father's photos taken at the front. Orwell's photos and a lot of his papers are still in Moscow from the raid on Eileen's bedroom in the hotel in Barcelona.
Yes. Yeah, I don't have any additional material. In fact, my father, before he passed away, had donated everything he had on hand that he knew of. But as it turns out, when someone passes away, there are boxes and drawers that he didn't go through. Yeah. So I inherited a thick manila envelope of additional documents, which I will pass on to Stanford. But
I think really what we're curious about is how he managed to get his photos home when others who were arrested had everything taken off them. Is that right, Richard?
I don't know how he smuggled it out.
No.
I don't know.
And what I found interesting, because I was really fascinated by this question as well, because again, that ILP section photograph I had not seen before I started looking through the papers in the Hoover Institute. And again, sort of trying to decipher what was going on there, it looked to me that actually had been sent to Harry by John Braithwaite. So it was somebody else had gotten it out and had sent it to Harry saying, like, here's a great photograph of you. Remember this moment where you created this soldiers committee. It was taken at that moment. So again, I don't know if that other famous photograph with Orwell and Eileen, if that was sent to your father as well, or if he managed to carry that out with him. But
well, it was small enough he might have hidden it in his clothing.
John Bowler, you wanted to ask a question? I'm pleased to see you're upright this month. I hope you're recovering well.
I'm in a plaster cast at the moment, so it comes off in 2 weeks. Thank you. I was just going to ask you. Thank you, David. Did your father ever talk about homage to Catalonia and give any views about how good a description it was of that period of the Spanish Civil War and Orwell's reflections on it? And did he later kind of follow Orwell's career in reading the subsequent books, particularly Animal Farm 1984, and talk about those?
Sure, absolutely. My father had always described Orwell as a guy who was as cool as a cucumber. He described to me on one occasion that they were on the train going back to Barcelona. This must have been the May days when they were going back to Barcelona, and that he got in an argument with someone on the train that was telling him, because Orwell had expressed an interest in joining the international brigades. He wanted to see real action and had indicated that he wanted to enlist in the international brigades. My father immediately told him he was out of his mind to do that as soon as he did that, he'd probably be executed because he had been associated with the POUM. And someone else was arguing with Orwell on the train, and Orwell handled it with such calm that my father came to that description of him being as cool as a cucumber in handling this guy. My father had a very short fuse. He wouldn't have handled it like that. He probably would have attacked the guy. But Orwell was the cool cucumber in this case. What was the other part of your question, sir?
I just wonder whether he ever made any comments about homage to Catalonia.
Oh, yes. Well, the only book that my father actually personally gave me as a gift was Homage to Catalonia. And it's the only thing I have in his own actual longhand. He wrote in it to my son, David Milton, very formally, to my son, David Milton. And then he quoted Shakespeare. He said, "Say not the struggle not availeth." I had to look that up to understand exactly what that meant. But he always believed that the good fight was the fight we all had to fight. It didn't matter ultimately if you lost, because the point was, if you gave in to evil and fascism before you fought them to the death, how much more would they just roll over you? So that was built into his philosophy of life.
Right. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Who would like to ask a question? Rick. Unmute, please, Rick.
Yes, I have. David, thank you very, very much indeed for your, that was a fascinating presentation, and you've actually raised certain little points which I'm quite interested in. If I may just make one tiny comment, was when they were in the trenches at 4 o'clock in the morning, when they were changing the guard, had it been the other way around, of course, your father would have missed the bullet completely. As I understand it, he was 5 foot tall, and my father was 6'3". And it's just interesting to note that the sniper who fired obviously let fly with a bullet, which I don't know whether it was any good or not. But the fact that it went through my father's throat and did no damage would suggest that it didn't actually have a great deal of zip behind it. And it obviously just simply passed through his throat, cauterized the wound, and that was the end of it. I'm just thinking, if my father had been 5'6", he would have taken it in the forehead, of course, wouldn't he? And
yes.
Would have blown his head out.
Right. But actually, the distance that they were apart in the trenches was what we would call in the States maybe 1,000 yards. The bullet actually was traveling at a velocity that was red hot. That's why it seared the entrance one. Yeah.
Yes, but I'm wondering whether, in fact, that the quality of the powder
yes.
Was not as good as it might have been. And in fact, it wasn't traveling quite as fast as it might have been at whatever it was it 2,500 meters per second? And it was only going at about 2,300 meters per second. And it traveled through his neck without too much devastation.
No, maybe.
I think the angle that Orwell stood up, he was probably, as Orwell's head was coming above the parapet, the sniper was probably taking aim, and in that microsecond he stood up completely, and the sniper.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes. Okay. So
yeah, he didn't aim lower.
Made a tiny difference. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much indeed. That was a fascinating evening.
Pleasure to meet you, Richard, and thank you so much for your reading.
Thank you very much indeed. That was super.
Also,
and I have to say farewell.
Also, perhaps the Franco troops knew that the quality of weaponry facing them wasn't that great, and the best Russian weaponry went down near Madrid rather than round Huesca. So it could have been part of it.
Well, I think that is probably quite right. I think they got second-grade weaponry and very ancient old Mausers.
Exactly.
One last question. If not, I think it's. Well, let's have Michael first then.
Hello. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you?
We can now. Yes, thanks.
Oh, okay. Well, I enjoyed the talk very much. I wondered if Harry ever wrote a lengthy account of his Spanish Civil War experiences.
No, he didn't, but he was interviewed extensively over the years. Different researchers and authors have included my father in a number of interviews and books. And I'm the one now that is being asked to supply additional information.
Oh, thank you.
My pleasure.
Sorry, Michael, there's a lot of light behind you and I just can't see you clearly. Les, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, David. I think you made a very interesting point about Harry's conversation with Orwell when Harry met Orwell and regarded him as politically naive, because his ILP colleagues later on, when they attended the ILP summer schools, felt that Orwell was incredibly politically informed. And it's interesting to hear someone meeting him at a time when he wasn't so well politically informed. So it sounds as if this is one of those stages of Orwell's life where conversation was very important to his intellectual development. And I think we should have a high regard for your father for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ben?
Thank you very much, David. That was fascinating. Just a quick one. We know that obviously Orwell and Eileen were being pursued by Soviet spies at the time, and obviously your father was in contact with Trotsky, as you mentioned. So we know his views on Stalin, but did he do much sort of overt sort of anti-Stalinist activism after the war? Did he do any writing which was sort of anti-Stalinist, anti-Soviet later in his career?
He remained active in reading about Trotsky and all things socialist, but when he came back from World War II, the thing he was most frightened of was trying to support a family. And he had 2 children by this point, and he was in his late 40s. So he did not remain active as far as this, he was not in the Socialist Party after that, but remained as a union organizer and supporting a family. And then later, he counseled young men against serving in Vietnam.
Very good. Well, thank you both very much for a fascinating evening.
Well, thank you so much.
Before we draw things to a close and formally thank you, I'd just like to let you know about next month's George Talk. One of our members, Richard Young, has a very extensive collection of Orwell material. His talk will cover a little bit about how Richard Young got into collecting, but it will mainly focus on Orwell's life as a writer through some of the objects in Richard's collection. He has a range of things: letters, original pamphlets, magazines, and first editions. What Richard would hope is that people will get an idea of the range of material there is available to collect and find it interesting to see some of the key items in their original form and understand a little bit more about the process that Orwell went through to get into print in the first place. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that. If you could all unmute now, I would like us all to say thank you very much to David and Chris for a super evening.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Well done.
So we will draw the evening to a conclusion now. As I said at the beginning, if anybody wishes to remain online and talk to David and Chris, please do. But this is the end of the recorded part of the evening. Thank you all very much.